The United States District Court for the Eastern District of Texas had earned a reputation as one of the most conservative federal courts in the nation. But nothing in its controversial history prepared observers for what was about to unfold in Courtroom 5 on this sweltering August afternoon. Judge Andrew H. Stones, a Reagan appointee with 23 years on the federal bench, was presiding over Henderson versus Texas Department of Education, a complex civil rights case challenging discriminatory practices in public school funding. The case had attracted national attention due to its potential impact on educational equity, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had taken the unusual step of personally arguing the case due to her expertise in civil rights law and her deep connection to the affected communities. Judge Stones entered his courtroom with the imperious demeanor that had characterized his judicial tenure for over 2 decades. His reputation for hostility towards civil rights cases and contempt for attorneys who challenged institutional racism was well established among the Texas legal community. But his lifetime appointment and powerful political connections had made him essentially untouchable despite numerous complaints about his conduct. His pale complexion and cold eyes seemed to embody the institutional racism that civil rights advocates had fought against for generations, and his presence on the bench represented everything that was wrong with lifetime tenure for federal judges who had outlived any pretense of judicial fairness. Jasmine sat at the plaintiff's table with her characteristic preparation and focus, but those familiar with her previous confrontations might have noticed that her leather briefcase seemed unusually large and was positioned within easy reach. Her research into Judge Stone's judicial record had uncovered patterns that went far beyond standard conservative judicial philosophy and revealed systematic racism that bordered on criminal conspiracy. She had hoped to win her case on its legal merits, but Stone's behavior during preliminary hearings had convinced her that extraordinary measures might be necessary to expose judicial corruption that had been destroying lives for over 20 years. The first 2 hours of the proceedings followed predictable patterns, with Stones interrupting Jasmine's arguments, making dismissive comments about civil rights law, and generally conducting himself with the arrogance of someone who believed himself above accountability. His questions were not genuine judicial inquiries, but rather rhetorical attacks designed to undermine the credibility of civil rights claims and intimidate attorneys who dare to challenge institutional racism. His contempt for the plaintiffs, primarily low-income students of color, was barely concealed behind a thin veneer of judicial authority. Jasmine's responses were masterful despite Stone's interruptions, weaving together constitutional law, educational policy, and statistical evidence in ways that demonstrated both the legal merit of her case and the broader pattern of discrimination affecting her clients. Even Stones seemed grudgingly impressed by her legal preparation, though his competitive nature and racial animus prevented him from acknowledging this directly. His attempts to trap her in legal technicalities consistently failed as she demonstrated mastery of both constitutional principles and procedural requirements. The turning point came when Stones decided to make his racism explicit by directly attacking not just Jasmine's legal arguments, but her qualifications and right to practice before his court. Ms. Crockett, he said, his voice dripping with condescension and barely concealed racial hostility, I find myself wondering whether you fully understand the complexity of federal civil rights law and the high standards required for practice in this court. Your arguments today suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of legal precedent and constitutional principles that frankly calls into question your competence to represent these plaintiffs in such an important matter. The courtroom fell silent at the unprecedented personal attack, which crossed clear lines of judicial propriety and revealed the racial animus that had motivated Stone's judicial decisions for decades. Several observers in the gallery appeared genuinely shocked, while others seemed unsurprised by behavior they had witnessed before but never seen challenged effectively. Court reporters and legal journalists recognized they were witnessing something significant, though they could not yet understand its full implications. Jasmine's response was calm, but carried an undercurrent that suggested she was shifting into a much more aggressive mode. Your Honor, I find your comments about legal competence and constitutional understanding particularly interesting, given the context of your own judicial record and decision-making patterns over the past 20 years. Since you've raised questions about qualifications and understanding of civil rights law, perhaps we should examine those concepts more closely as they apply to your own conduct on this bench. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew what appeared to be an enormous FBI file folder, easily 3 inches thick and marked with official federal seals and classification stamps. The sight of such extensive federal documentation in a routine civil rights case immediately changed the atmosphere in the courtroom, as everyone present understood that something unprecedented was about to occur. I'm particularly curious about your definition of constitutional principles and legal precedent, Your Honor, especially as they relate to the systematic violation of civil rights that has characterized your judicial tenure since your appointment to this court in 2001. Stone's confident expression flickered as he sensed that something was seriously wrong, but his decades of unchallenged judicial authority had made him believe he was untouchable regardless of what accusations might be leveled against him. Ms. Crockett, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this court will not tolerate any attempts to deflect from the legal issues properly before us through personal attacks or political theater. What I'm doing, Your Honor, is providing context for your comments about legal competence and constitutional understanding. Jasmine opened the FBI file and removed the first section of documents, which appear to be statistical analyses and case summaries marked with federal investigation stamps. This is a preliminary report from a federal civil rights investigation that has been examining your judicial record for the past 18 months. The investigation was initiated based on complaints from the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and over 200 individual attorneys who've documented patterns of discriminatory conduct in your courtroom. The silence in Courtroom 5 was complete as the implications of a federal investigation into Stone's conduct became clear. The FBI file represented not just accusations, but documented evidence of systematic judicial misconduct that had apparently been under federal scrutiny for over a year. Court officers, attorneys, and observers sat frozen as they processed the magnitude of what was being revealed. The statistical analysis in this report covers every case you have presided over during your 23-year tenure on this court. Jasmine held up charts and graphs that showed clear patterns of discriminatory decision-making. The data shows that African American plaintiffs in civil rights cases have a 0.3% success rate in your courtroom, compared to a national average of 47% for similar cases in other federal districts. She turned to another page of statistics. Latino plaintiffs fare even worse, with a success rate of 0.1%. In contrast, white plaintiffs challenging civil rights protections have a 93% success rate in your courtroom. But Jasmine was just beginning her systematic destruction of Stone's judicial career and reputation. She produced additional sections of the FBI file that contained detailed case analyses and documented patterns of bias that went far beyond statistical disparities. The federal investigation identified 15,000 individual cases where your decisions appear to have been motivated by racial animus rather than legal reasoning. The report documents numerous instances where you ignored binding precedent, misrepresented evidence, and issued rulings that had no basis in law when the plaintiffs were people of color. Stone sat motionless behind the bench, his face cycling through emotions of shock, fear, and what appeared to be recognition that his carefully hidden racism was being exposed with the full weight of federal law enforcement documentation. The authority and judicial temperament that had defined his public persona for decades was crumbling in real time before the legal establishment and civil rights community. Ms. Crockett, this is completely inappropriate and represents a clear attempt to obstruct justice and intimidate this court through fabricated allegations. Fabricated? Jasmine produced audio recording equipment from the FBI file. Your Honor, the investigation includes extensive audio surveillance of your chambers, recorded with proper federal warrants based on credible allegations of civil rights violations. The recordings document conversations where you explicitly discuss your intention to deny justice to minority plaintiffs regardless of legal merit. The courtroom erupted in gasps and horrified whispers as the existence of federal surveillance recordings became clear. The idea that a sitting federal judge had been under FBI investigation and audio surveillance represented a level of suspected criminality that few observers had ever imagined possible in the federal judiciary. But Jasmine's most devastating revelation was still to come. She accessed what appeared to be transcripts of the recorded conversations, marked with FBI surveillance stamps and legal authorization numbers. This transcript is from a conversation that took place in your chambers on March 15th of last year. You were meeting with several other federal judges who share your racial views, and the conversation was recorded as part of the ongoing federal investigation into judicial conspiracy and civil rights violations. She began reading from the transcript in a voice that carried clearly throughout the silent courtroom. Quote, "The key is to make our decisions look legally sound while ensuring that these people never get the justice they think they deserve. We can use procedural technicalities, standing requirements, and statute of limitations arguments to deny their claims without appearing overtly racist. The beauty of lifetime tenure is that nobody can stop us from protecting white interests as long as we're careful about our language." Unquote. The chamber erupted into chaos as the full scope of Stone's racist conspiracy became clear. He wasn't just making biased individual decisions. He was part of an organized effort by multiple federal judges to systematically deny civil rights protections to minority Americans. The implications for thousands of cases and millions of affected Americans were staggering and would require comprehensive federal intervention to address. The transcript continued with even more damaging revelations about the scope and organization of the judicial conspiracy. Jasmine read additional quotes that revealed a network of racist federal judges who had been coordinating their efforts to undermine civil rights law for over a decade. Quote, "We need to be strategic about which cases we take and how we rule. The goal is to create precedents that will make it nearly impossible for minorities to win civil rights cases in any federal court. If we can establish enough adverse precedents, we can essentially nullify the Civil Rights Act without Congress being able to do anything about it." Unquote. The courtroom was in complete upheaval as the magnitude of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just individual judicial bias. It was an organized effort to subvert federal civil rights law through coordinated judicial corruption. The revelation that multiple federal judges have been working together to deny constitutional protections to minority Americans represented a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions. Stone's attempts to maintain judicial authority were increasingly desperate and incoherent as the evidence mounted against him. I order this presentation to stop immediately. These recordings are illegally obtained and represent a politically motivated attack on judicial independence designed to intimidate federal courts. Actually, Your Honor, these recordings were obtained through proper federal warrants issued by other federal judges based on credible evidence of criminal conspiracy to violate civil rights. Jasmine produced additional FBI documents that showed the legal authorization for the surveillance. The investigation is being conducted under the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which specifically authorizes federal prosecution of government officials who conspire to deny constitutional rights to American citizens. She held up what appeared to be a criminal referral document marked with Department of Justice seals. This is a criminal referral recommending that you and 4 other federal judges be prosecuted for conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. The potential penalties include removal from office and up to life imprisonment for the most serious civil rights violations. Jasmine delivered her final statement with the gravity of someone who understood she was participating in a historic moment of civil rights accountability. Your Honor, you began today's proceedings by questioning my competence and understanding of civil rights law. You suggested that I lack the qualifications to represent minority plaintiffs in cases involving constitutional rights. She gestured to the FBI evidence spread across the plaintiff's table. The evidence shows that you have spent 23 years systematically violating the constitutional rights of minority Americans while hiding behind judicial robes and lifetime tenure. You've participated in a criminal conspiracy that has denied justice to 15,000 individual plaintiffs and undermined the civil rights protections that millions of Americans depend on for basic human dignity. Most importantly, you betrayed every principle of equal justice under law that defines American constitutional democracy. The courtroom erupted in sustained applause from the public gallery, with many people standing to acknowledge what they had witnessed. The applause continued for several minutes, representing not just approval of Jasmine's presentation, but recognition that they had witnessed a moment of genuine accountability for judicial racism that had operated with impunity for decades. Federal marshals began moving toward the bench, apparently having received instructions about how to handle the unprecedented constitutional crisis that was unfolding. Within hours of the courtroom revelation, Stones announced his immediate resignation from the federal bench pending resolution of the criminal investigation. The FBI confirmed that they had been investigating a network of federal judges for civil rights violations and that additional arrests and resignations were expected in the coming weeks. The Department of Justice announced that a special prosecutor would be appointed to investigate the full scope of the judicial conspiracy and determine which cases might need to be reopened due to racial bias and constitutional violations. The immediate aftermath sent shockwaves through the federal judiciary and civil rights community. Every case decided by Stones and the other judges under investigation became subject to review, with particular attention paid to civil rights cases that had been dismissed or decided against minority plaintiffs. Thousands of cases were immediately appealed or reopened, and multiple class action lawsuits were filed seeking compensation for victims of the judicial conspiracy. For the civil rights movement, Stone's exposure represented vindication of decades of complaints about systemic racism in the federal judiciary and proof that organized resistance to civil rights protections continued to operate at the highest levels of government. The revelation also triggered comprehensive reforms in judicial oversight and accountability, with new mechanisms for investigating and removing judges who violated their constitutional obligations. 3 months after the courtroom revelation, Stones pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into judicial racism. His cooperation led to additional arrests and revealed a network of racist judges that extended throughout multiple federal circuits and involved hundreds of cases over more than 2 decades. For Jasmine, the encounter represented the culmination of her career as a civil rights advocate and demonstrated her commitment to exposing institutional racism regardless of personal or professional consequences. Her decision to use federal investigation evidence during routine litigation showed that she was willing to risk everything to ensure that judicial racism could not continue to operate with impunity behind the protection of lifetime tenure. But the victory came with significant personal costs and risks. Jasmine faced death threats from white supremacist organizations and racist judicial allies who viewed her exposure of the conspiracy as an attack on white judicial authority rather than a defense of constitutional rights. Federal security agencies provided enhanced protection for her and her family, understanding that her revelation had made her a target for individuals and organizations that had benefited from judicial racism for decades. The broader impact on American civil rights law was profound and lasting. The Stones case demonstrated that systematic judicial racism could operate for decades when proper oversight and accountability mechanisms were absent, but it also showed that such racism could be exposed and prosecuted when dedicated individuals were willing to risk everything for constitutional justice. The case fundamentally changed how civil rights cases were litigated and how judicial bias was identified and challenged. 6 months after Stone's conviction and imprisonment, the federal judiciary had implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent systematic racism and ensure that judges who violated constitutional rights could be quickly identified and removed. The reforms included regular statistical analysis of judicial decision-making patterns, enhanced civil rights training for all federal judges, and new mechanisms for investigating and prosecuting judicial misconduct when it violated constitutional protections. as both Jasmine and the American civil rights movement moved forward from the Stone scandal. The lessons of that August afternoon in Courtroom 5 remained as a reminder of both the persistence and the ultimate defeatability of institutional racism when confronted by thorough investigation and courageous advocacy. Jasmine had shown that even the most entrenched judicial racism could be exposed and prosecuted when civil rights advocates were willing to use every available tool to ensure constitutional accountability. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Judge Andrew H. Stones would be remembered as a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for civil rights and judicial accountability in American democracy. It demonstrated that even lifetime tenured federal judges could be held accountable for systematic racism when their constitutional violations were thoroughly documented and courageously exposed by advocates committed to equal justice under law above all other considerations.